Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another FS Club webinar. My name is Michael Mainelli, and it's my delight today to be featuring Marc Schlossman, one of my dear friends. And today's subject is somewhat off topic, but it, I think, focuses us very much on what matters in life. And Marc is going to talk today about going, gone, and the Extinction project that he's doing. There's a tremendous amount of material on the website, as you know, and that's the way that we like things. So I'm not going to do any lengthy introductions, but Marc is a world acclaimed photographer whom I met back in 1980 in Easter on the tarmac of Keflavik Airport just in Iceland. So we'll leave that, and we've stayed in touch, obviously, for subsequent 40 years, which is rather depressing for me, Marc. But good to see you here.
Good to be here.
Yeah. And Marc's going to be presenting some amazing imagery as well, but I would encourage you to go out to the website and look at large portions of that, and frankly, some of his other work with Noriega, The Economist, etc. Now, we're only able to do this thanks to the tolerance of our sponsors, who let us range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance with a social purpose. And today is going to be much more about that social purpose. What is the purpose of finance? Can it help us in many ways to ensure that extinction doesn't proceed at the rate that it's going? Now, my job, as you know, is to get out of your way so that you can hear from Marc. But just before I do so, I'd like to remind you of two things. The first is to use the GoToWebinar facility to ask questions, to make comments. There are quite a few people online at the moment, so do get your questions or comments in early so that I can feed them later into the conversation at around 10:30. Please don't email me. I'm here with you, not online. The second thing is we've got a tiny little poll just to get the brain cells tickling. The background extinction rate is the rate before man was a primary contributor to extinction. It's a widely disputed figure in many ways, but estimates are there was probably about one extinction per million species years. About 27,000 species would go extinct in any 1 year. You can work out the ratios there. Or the average species lasts around 1 million years. So the question for you this morning, to what order of magnitude would most researchers agree the current rate is above the background extinction rate? So Morgan, if you wouldn't mind launching the poll, we'll get people's thoughts.
Launching the poll now. If everyone can please vote, we'll have this open for about 60 seconds and then I'll close it. Already up to 75% voted. Brilliant. I'll give another 5 seconds just for the remaining to vote and then we'll close it down. Brilliant. Closing it down now.
Okay. Well, Marc, I think we have a rather informed audience.
Okay.
Because it is true that most researchers would agree, B, that the current rate, due to mankind, the Anthropocene era, as it's often called, about 100 to 1,000 times greater extinction rate than historically. Anyway, that's me out of your way, and now I'd like to hand over to Marc. Marc, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, hello, everyone. And Michael, thank you kindly for the opportunity to be here today. And thank you to Morgan Rose at Zien for producing a really terrific slide presentation of the images. And so to put my project in today's context, let me ask you a question. What is the biggest lesson we can learn from the pandemic? And for me, the answer is, if we mess with Mother Nature, if we poke Mother Nature in the eye, she will turn around and knock our species to the ground, with consequences for just about everything we used to take for granted in the world we've constructed for ourselves. And I'm a freelance photographer and videographer. I was born in Chicago, and I've lived and worked in London since 1987. But let me take you a little further back than 87 to the 1970s. And one summer when I was in high school, all I did was catalog mink skulls from one mink farm in Kenosha, Wisconsin, writing sequential numbers on skulls with a technical drawing pen all summer in one room with what seemed like an infinite supply of mink specimens that needed to be cataloged. I was volunteering in the mammals collection in the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, one of the 4 biggest natural history collections in the world. So that summer, I had a lot of time to think about how many specimens there might be in that building. Because if I'm spending all summer labeling skulls from just one farm, I'm thinking just how overwhelmingly big is this entire place and how many specimens are in here? And how many in all the collections, not just zoology? And walking alone in those hallways with a nearly endless number of specimens was really, really moving. So 30 years later, and 12 years ago, I took my twin sons on a behind-the-scenes tour at the museum, and John Bates, the birds collection manager, opened a drawer, and in there was a really beautiful set of bird specimens, and some of the birds were extinct species. And you pick one up and you hold it, and it's just amazing to have the opportunity to see how an ivory-billed woodpecker or a passenger pigeon is built, in its feathers, its colors, and no glass case between you and this bird. And my overpowering thought was, this is gone forever, and that's it. The last chance to see this species is in your hand, this drawer, this cabinet, and these hallways. And so over the next few months, I developed an idea to channel my outrage at the damage our species is doing in the world. And something I realized I had been feeling for a really long time, and that just kind of reached critical mass as I held those species in my hands. So I approached John Bates with the idea for a non-commissioned personal project to shoot endangered and extinct species as a way of making the viewer confront a selection of these beautiful animals up close, a long list, one after the other, combining these images with their stories of decline. And John said, let's do it. Start with the birds, and I'll introduce you to my colleagues in the other divisions. But you have to convince them to give you access to their collections. You have to convince them to give you access. You'll need to perform a few Jedi mind tricks. And actually, the culture at the Field Museum is very progressive and open in this way because they're receptive to different ways of interpreting the collections. So, for instance, the painter Peggy McNamara has been artist in residence there for many years, and she's also an associate of the zoology program. So the museum is open to ways of working in the collections other than strictly research. So over the 10 years, I gradually made my way through the zoology and botany collections. So it was birds, amphibians, reptiles, fishes, insects, invertebrates, mammals, and plants, and actually in that order. And it also helped that I had volunteered in the mammals collection during those summers in high school. Because as another collection manager said to me later, hey, you volunteered, your family. Volunteers are the museum's lifeblood. So the project in photographs and in text, the project and its website document over 130 species of endangered and extinct animals and plants, all specimens found in the collections of the Field Museum. And I felt that large-scale issues such as habitat loss were not getting enough public debate, and I wanted to say something about human domination of the biosphere by examining the reasons for biodiversity loss. At its core, this project has always been simply about this: mankind's changing relationship with the natural world. Life on Earth is fragile, and in this pandemic, that is impossible to ignore. So over time, I produced a list of species whose stories collectively illustrate the reasons for decline: overexploitation, pollution, climate change, the wildlife trade, invasive species, disease, and by far the greatest contributing factor, habitat loss. I'm a photographer, but this work is not just about the images of the specimens or the species themselves. It is about, and it is led by, the reasons for decline affecting these and all species. I want the photos to lead you to the text. The work is more or less complete at 130 species because that number is sufficient to provide a review of the extinction process. I chose many overlooked non-charismatic species to highlight the equal importance of each species in an ecosystem. Darwin showed us that all living things are related to each other. So you take one thing out of an interconnected system where each species depends on the others, and that ecosystem is weaker, more at risk. The work to conserve non-charismatic species needs a lot more public attention, more funding, and more research compared to charismatic species with donor appeal. And let's quickly look at the importance of natural history collections. When I'm walking through the collection surrounded by silence and thousands of specimens, I think a lot about the human obsessive compulsion to gather, order, and label things, unique to our species, which is simply our attempt to understand the world. In any case, the key thing to know, specimens become more valuable over time. And why? Because specimens are historical records. And specimen collections document the presence of a species in place and in time. And to do that, specimens must be coupled with information about where and when they were collected. Collection managers have nightmares about a specimen losing its label. As one collection manager told me, a specimen without the where and the when is just a dead body. And there's a really common question: why does a museum need so many specimens? And again, specimens become more valuable over time. Collections are a historical record that provide a biodiversity baseline, enabling researchers to track changes in species and communities, correlating those patterns with natural or human-related changes in the environment, such as climate change and habitat loss. Right now, there are new species already in the drawers and cabinets of collections, sometimes decades after they were collected, waiting to be discovered, waiting for researchers to ask the right questions, possibly using tools that may not even be invented yet. For instance, any specimens collected before the 1970s could not have been subjected to the kinds of questions that have been answered since the 1970s using DNA sequencing technology. And while we're here back in time, let's talk a little bit about the history of collecting. So the golden age of collecting was the second half of the 1800s, and all the world's important natural history collections grew rapidly at that time. And expeditions sent around the globe for sometimes years returned with huge quantities of specimens, feeding a collection fever as academic institutions and museums acquired specimens for education and research. And before cinema and television, collections educated the public and created awareness at a time when taxidermy and museum exhibits were the best way to present the real world to a wide audience. But as collecting became big business, serious discussion evolved around conservation, loss of biodiversity, and mankind's relationship to the natural world. So we think of these issues as contemporary, but in fact, we've been wrestling with them for well over a century. In any case, the biggest collections are now historical baselines, time machines with roughly 2 centuries of what is effectively data in physical, 3-dimensional form. And as collections are digitized, that information is available to everyone online. So it finally occurred to me that the work of a collection manager is never done. Every morning, the doors are unlocked, the lights are turned on, and the collections are still there. There's a constant flow every day of maintenance, hosting visiting researchers, shipping specimens to researchers all over the world, specimens shipped back and returned to the collection. Maintaining collections this big, of course, is endless. And the pace of a working day at the museum reflects this, because I needed to save a lot of time each day just to meet and talk to people in addition to the shooting I was doing. I saw very little evidence of the rat race in the museum, and I got used to having lots of unscheduled, long conversations about recent travels, new research, describing new species, baseball, and of the utmost importance, which Chicago deep dish pizza joint is the best. And a quick comment on the importance of volunteers, and this cannot be overstated. The museum would collapse if it were not for the work volunteers do. Collection managers are so grateful for volunteers. They return specimens to the collection, tag specimens with labels, top up jars with alcohol, and enter specimen data in databases. So before each trip to the museum, I researched online and read about the species I wanted to shoot. I looked for them in the museum's online databases and then discussed what I was looking for with collection managers. But then an interesting thing happens when you actually get there and set up a makeshift studio at the end of an isolated hallway. Collection staff would pass by the alcove I had set up with a white seamless paper backdrop and a large piece of black velvet, used as backgrounds to shoot the specimens. And always the first question was, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I tell them and find out who they are and what they do. And they would say, "Hey, that's interesting. Have you thought about this species?" And maybe that afternoon or a couple of days later, They would wheel a trolley over with specimens and start telling me about them. So they basically became co-conspirators, and this kind of collaboration was definitely not something I had anticipated before I started shooting, but it became possibly the most important way that my list of species grew over the 10 years. So the public discussion of extinction is getting wide, it's getting deep, and it's getting increasingly sophisticated as our concerns about the environment increase. So I'm looking for a publisher now, a book publisher now, and I have one publisher reject my proposal because they said readers would come away thinking there's nothing they can do about the loss of biodiversity. And okay, yes, the current title of the website, simply the word extinction, is direct, but it's intended as a kind of declaration of a process that day to day is ongoing, taking place right now, minute to minute, but it's really easy for us to ignore it. And we can only learn about and discuss these issues by facing them directly, of course, and hopefully this will become a legacy of the pandemic. So out of the 130 species on my list, less than 20% are actually extinct. Most of the species can be saved now with robust conservation efforts. And there are a lot of conservation successes featured in the work. And again, reading is very important with this project. And I would say more important than the images, really, because the photographs are intended to make people curious about what they see, leading them to the stories, the history, lessons, and messages in the text for each species. So there's something tragic about where we find ourselves today. 20 years ago, the outdoor gear company, Patagonia, were congratulating themselves and us on how they were now making fleece garments from recycled plastic water bottles. Now, with recent research, it turns out that every time you wash a fleece jacket, it lays down a sedimentary layer of microplastic particles on the ocean floor, poisoning marine species and affecting food chains. What seemed like an amazing development in recycling turns out to have other consequences because, of course, plastic just does not decompose quickly. The tragic element is that even as we try to do the right thing, what we find out years later, as our research abilities expand and become more sophisticated, is that there are consequences that we didn't know of before. Our inability to see exactly how economic growth will affect the future of the biosphere does not get us off the hook as a species, but as stewards of all life on Earth, to what extent do we hold ourselves to account for what we don't know about the future we are making? It's a big question, and with increasing urgency, we definitely need to answer it. Here's a quote from a 2006 study on the future of conservation biology. Conservation is primarily not about biology, but about people and the choices they make. We have slowed down our world in so many ways during this pandemic. It's an opportunity to remind ourselves we are not separate from nature. There's no time today to talk about climate change, habitat destruction, resource extraction, or an economic growth model that is in conflict with the natural world. If this wasn't a webinar, we could all just head up to the pub later and solve those problems. But if Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England and now UN climate envoy, if Carney says the global financial system is in deep trouble if the financial and industrial sectors do not act to reduce carbon emissions, then hopefully we start getting real action from exactly where action is needed. I was interviewed last year for a news and ideas website for the Center for Biological Diversity, an American conservation NGO. And when we were done, I asked the journalist, John Platt, about his own work, and he said to me, you know, our work in this area, by definition, is an exercise in hope. We wouldn't be doing it if we thought it's game over right now, and if we thought that nothing can be saved. The collection managers I worked with at the Field Museum are smart, reasonable, and passionate scientists who know more than most about where the world is headed. There are a lot of loud, shrill, and negative voices out there right now in public discussions around biodiversity loss and environmental issues, but not one of those voices is a collection manager. In my 10 years working there, not one of them ever told me that the sky is falling. Every one of them would tell you that we have done a lot of damage, but there's still time to go in a different direction and time to do what is necessary to conserve the species and the habitat that are left. So that quote again, conservation is primarily not about biology, but about people and the choices they make. Last year, I presented this project to some of the smartest people I've ever met. 3 classes of 9-year-old students in a school in East London. And at the end of the day, a boy in the front row asked me this. He said, "So Mark, if we buy less stuff, recycle more, and get along better with animals, then we can make the world better?" And I thought, yes, precisely, you've nailed it. His question was more like a set of directions on a roadmap. First, make better use of all natural resources. And second, respect the natural world and how we live our lives because we are part of the natural world. And at this point in history, what other choice do we have? Thank you.
Mark, that was an amazing presentation and very sobering, particularly as we have time to sit and think a little bit. Got a few questions here. Rod Rees-Jones is curious. Did you consider including legible labels within the photographs?
Legible. Yes, that would have been a good idea. Thank you. Next time I make this presentation, I will put common names and Latin names. Excellent. Thank you,
Yeah,
Rodrigo.
but also I assume in the published work you'll have quite a bit of detail on the side about the species and all. Is that correct? Yeah.
So basically, the way the website works is, and the way the project was designed, so I wanted to keep it very simple, and I wanted the photographs to be very graphically easy to read, and hence the solid color backdrops like black and white, and perhaps some things that I found like desktops and light boxes I found at the museum. The most important bit for me was commissioning the writer Lauren Hines to write up all the species, and I can write, but I'm slow. It would have taken me years to do all the species. I commissioned her to write up the whole 130. She researched them, she wrote them up, I edited them. But again, as I said a couple times in just a few minutes ago, it's the stories. I want people to go to the stories. So you get interested looking at the picture and then read. And they're not too long, but there's some really incredible stories there. And gradually it kind of builds up a picture of where we are with, habitat destruction and pollution and what's been happening and what is happening, and what we have to do with conservation.
You referred to the Field Museum in Chicago as one of the 4 largest. Just off the top of your head, do you know the other 3?
Yeah, okay, so there's the Field, there's the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I believe the big Natural History Museum in Paris is one of them. And the Smithsonian in Washington is the 4th, and it's bigger than all the other ones combined. So it's funny, the British Museum of the Natural History Museum, everywhere else in the world except here is referred to as the British Museum of Natural History. So if you get a specimen with a label and it says BMNH, that's and then a number, that's the specimen number for the Natural History Museum specimens. So.
Okay. We've got some keen photographers in the audience. Simon West was wondering if you could just briefly describe your photo setup, please.
Okay, I had to take wherever they could put me, and usually those spaces were no more than sort of 5-6 feet wide, maybe 10 feet, 12 feet deep. I bought a 3-foot roll of white seamless paper, bought a couple of big pieces of black velvet, and made kind of a seamless backdrop, which is kind of a curve that goes down from stands and then curves towards the camera. And I shoot Nikon cameras, and I use 2 speed lights. So really there's nothing very sophisticated about the gear. I just used speed lights and bounced the lights off of whatever wall surfaces I could find and off of what pieces of white card and things. The most difficult things to shoot are jars. So in the photography industry, shooting drinks is very, very difficult. So something in glass, the specimens in jars were really difficult. I usually use 2 lights for those, but for the things on white, I kept it really simple. I kind of wanted the basic simplicity of a mugshot. So in a lot of cases, I just used 1 light to keep it really, really simple.
Cliff Moyse is curious. Did Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, that great work, did it make any material difference to extinction rates in North America?
Did Rachel Carson? Oh,
did it level off after that, or as it just kept going up?
I think what it did is it raised awareness. I wouldn't have any figures on extinction rates. But when you get to that quote about conservation and people's choices and things, I think Silent Spring, Carson's book Silent Spring, was a real watershed moment for the environmental movement, and people realized it was serious. And I think it had big effects on the chemical production industries. And yeah, beyond that though, I don't really have any figures.
Okay.
I mean, what do you think, Michael? Have you read it?
Oh, of course,
Yeah,
no,
same.
it was almost required reading in the
Yeah, true.
70s.
Yep.
I personally doubt it had much difference one way or the other. As you say, it raised awareness, but I think the drivers, the ones that you focus on quite rightly, particularly habitat loss, has been going, and a lot of that is population induced. I was born into a world of about 2.4 billion, and now we're starting to touch 8. So that there's a tremendous amount of habitat loss in that, and I would point to that in terms of extinction as the biggest thing. Climate change is a little bit further out, I suspect. But anyway, um, were there a couple of people are curious? Not you, but the staff you were working with. Do they all have kind of their own favorite area? One's into frogs and somebody else is into butterflies, or is there sort of a group of species that they think ought to be highlighted? What do the staff think?
Yeah, birds people are really, really militant. They're like, birds are best. Why would anybody want to shoot it? Why would anybody want to study anything else? I mean, they are really, as I say, quite militant. The collection managers are in charge of one. If you're a birds manager, you only manage the birds collections, and that's enough. It takes a lifetime to do that. Amphibians and reptiles is one division, and fishes. Um, and I gave the list earlier, but each one of those has a chief collection manager, and then assistant collection managers, and then volunteers. So each time I worked in birds for a couple of weeks, a few weeks, and then decided I wanted to go to amphibians and reptiles, but I basically had to go sell my project to amphibians and reptiles collection manager. Um, as this thing kind of started rolling downhill and getting bigger and gaining speed, people kind of knew about it. So I think the last zoology collection manager I saw was in mammals, and he knew who I was by then, although I had never sat down and sort of had a long conversation with him. But I still had to sell each one, and it would have been a little bit tight if I hadn't been able to get to like if I hadn't been able to shoot in mammals, if he hadn't granted me that access, I would be short one. My original idea was to go to other museums to shoot that. That's kind of a longer story, but I managed to get it all done in the field museum.
Hmm. By the way, Orono Ocha reminds us both that Silent Spring helped ban DDT from the US at least. Good
Exactly.
point,
Yeah,
Ron.
that's
Yeah, thank you.
exactly.
Well spotted there. Although I have seen some recent research wondering if DDT wasn't so bad, believe it or not.
No, really.
So yeah, it's always this unintended consequences. We are a big species with a lot of hobnail boots stomping around.
It's
Um,
the more I completely agree, and like it's almost like the more we find out, the sharper our tools get, the more we find out we don't know. I mean, I think and I think that's one of the things about the poll, for instance. Maybe it was a little this might be a little controversial, but I thought the question was interesting, almost so that we could get to talk about exactly what I just said, which is like, if we're talking about an order of magnitude difference, what are we arguing about there? I mean, the rate of extinction is high, even with choice A. It's more than it was, and we've got to do something about it, So, yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting for me too to do a bit of background on that poll question. I was curious, and then to see the range of uncertainties in it. But as you point out, all high. The question is it higher or much higher or very, very much higher? All
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Well, just a couple interesting questions here. We got to Bob McDowell. As you said, it's all about the choices we humans make. Do you have any thoughts on what species should be preserved and what should be allowed to become extinct?
Allowed to become extinct. Wow. I get a little frustrated with, I mentioned earlier, the species with, donor appeal, like whales, polar bears, tigers. elephants. They all need to. We need to keep them around. We just need to sort of start doing better by all these animals. That's a very interesting question. Like, what could we lose and get away with? And I think there's another figure that goes along with the poll question is we are discovering, I mean, the estimates of the number of species that actually are out there that we haven't, and the number we haven't discovered are unbelievable, like in the millions or the tens of millions. And we hardly know what we could lose without causing big problems in other parts of an ecosystem. So it's a difficult question. I'll think a lot about that one after after the session.
Well, I was heavily involved with the International Fund for Animal Welfare for nearly 10 years. And one of the things that we were curious about was the megafauna question, but do they represent in some way the kind of the top of the habitat? And is there therefore pull through by preserving them? Again, an unproven assertion, but one that we're interested in. Bob wants to then also sort of turn, if you could, Mark, to the collections themselves. Sort of a two-part question. How do you rationalize collections which become too large? If so, how? Or should collections never be rationalized? But that implies unlimited resources there as well. And he continues with a sort of a supplementary. And how would you prioritize preservation on the basis that choices have to be made? Any thoughts on those 2 points?
I guess to the extent that the Field Museum is the only one I know really well, basically, the short answer to that relative to the field is that they've run out of room. So they're in a huge building, but then on one side of the building, they dug out excavated a huge amount of earth, and then they put in this very state-of-the-art collections research center, and that's it. They can't go any further. They would have to find other space outside of Chicago or off that site. Like, for instance, the birds unit for the Natural History Museum is out in Tring, so it's possible to do that. Prioritizing, I think, if any of the collection managers were here, they would just say every one of these collections is as important as the other, and it wouldn't be about prioritizing. It would be about, if something was falling behind, you'd have to go in and get it up to the same level of preservation as everything else. Because they're really strong in this idea of, we're preserving these for future generations. We're going to be smarter than us. The thing I talked about, we don't even have the questions yet because we don't have the tools to ask them. They talk about that a lot. So something that might seem kind of unimportant, like a big box of tiny beetles versus preserving ivory-billed woodpeckers, you just don't know how important a bit of research about those beetles might be in the future. So I think if collection managers would say that each of their colleagues' collections is as important as the next.
Yeah, I had a small hand with a friend of mine, Professor Aliff, in saving the Bart's pathology collection, which is, of course, the human tissue samples there. And that was over a decade ago. And then suddenly we found out that buried in that collection was a little bit of assistance on Kawasaki disease. That was a few years ago. And of course, Kawasaki disease is now featured as a related ailment, perhaps, to some of the COVID cases in young children. Complex story there, but who would have thought that was the important thing? And I think it underscores your other bit there about the label. Thankfully, the labels are there. Without the labels, the collection is worthless.
Absolutely, yeah, and unless you have that baseline from in history, you have nothing to compare to at this point. The DDT example is really the one that is talked about a lot, but you just mentioned a really fascinating one. So yeah, in terms of Kawasaki's disease.
Rhonda is interested in the museums themselves, because you were working very closely. How do they make room for species that are near extinction? Do they actually look at it that way? And she's also curious, do some museums share their overflow with other museums around the world?
Wow, I guess I don't know about the second part. They share them in the sense that if somebody wants to do some research, they just make an application, and that kind of sharing and shipping specimens back and forth is kind of happening constantly. And the first part of the question, Michael, please again, was
do they make space for species that are near extinction? Are they looking ahead, I guess?
To the extent, this probably won't answer the question directly, but the Field Museum is a very progressive collection, whereas I believe the Natural History Museum here, it has its mission is more of preservation and less of growing in size, as I understand it, because they have lots of historical. They have Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. They have some specimens that are incredibly valuable, and the field is. I've been to the Field Museum when somebody's come up with a, sort of a car full of boxes filled with paper bags that have dead birds that have hit buildings in Chicago during migration season, and they'll take all those birds in. They'll take any roadkill in. If you hit a porcupine on the road in Minnesota, if you can get it to the museum, they will take it in, put it in a freezer, and prepare it. As long as you know where you hit the porcupine and when, they'll take it in. It's a very progressive in the sense of growing, which is why it's running out of room so quickly. But as far as prioritizing species that are critically endangered, I guess I don't know too much about that priority process, but the field, for instance, would definitely take it in and be very happy to have it.
Well, we got some interesting comments as well at both ends of the spectrum. Donald McCrae wonders if we should eliminate or eradicate or wipe out viruses. And Cliff Moyse is wondering if we should let humans become extinct. So that's kind of intriguing. And I'm getting a new version of what it means to be out in the field. I can imagine I'm going to be chatting to a lot of botanists and zoologists. I'm doing field work, and actually they're sitting in the museum. Interesting a bit here. Hugh Purser wants to go back to your reasons for extinction table. How is that measured? Is that research you've had?
You mean the different conservations? I guess I haven't done a deep dive into how it works. I spend a lot of time doing research. I almost have a web page up at all times brought to the IUCN Red List site, which is kind of the Bible for even the collection managers at the museum would refer to that. And how they do it, that's a really interesting question. I guess I don't have a great answer for that. I take it kind of take it on faith that the IUCN does a really good job.
Ian Harris is curious, did this photographic project fundamentally change your perception or views on conservation, or was it simply a progression of your prevailing views prior to the project?
Okay. So I have an undergraduate degree in wildlife biology, and I kind of quickly decided after I graduated that I didn't want to get straight into biology. I didn't find photography until quite a bit later. But this project is really interesting in the sense that it kind of like those two things fold back together now. That concern about environmental issues and ecology, et cetera, it kind of folds into photography, and this has been really, really satisfying. And I'm thinking of a quote by Dr. Seuss, and it basically goes like this: adults are obsolete children, and to hell with them. And to the previous reader's comment of should our species be allowed to sort of exist, I sometimes kind of feel that way when I kind of start thinking about or start really reading about all the things that Lauren researched and came up in the texts and things. And yeah, I also think I kind of knew the species I wanted to put in this collection. I kind of made a collection from a collection, as it were. But when I read what Lauren had written, and I kind of saw the stories in detail, I kind of felt even stronger that this project is a good one, and it's a good one to do. So yeah.
Well, Mark Duff would echo that. It seems to me that the young will change the world for the better, and he's hoping that you get sponsorship to play a copy of the book in all the UK primary schools. So very supportive there. Sort of another question. You had 130 specimens, and you in your remarks you said that 20% of them had gone extinct. Amazing how we say that. It is. We don't talk about kill. They just went extinct. Could you what did you have a favorite amongst them, or well, favorite's probably the wrong thing, but what made you saddest?
Saddest, wow. I think because it's happening right now, when you start reading about pangolin, it's become quite charismatic because it's very docile and it's very easy to catch, and you just think this thing is going to die out very, very quickly because it's just too easy to collect. And you kind of start, you then need to start talking about the wildlife trade and the parts of the world where it's really where the wildlife trade is really big. I think we can leave that, but I mean, unless demand for pangolin scales reduces, is decreased, that animal is going to die out, and it's going to happen pretty quick. So I think the things that are sort of in danger of dying out pretty quick are the ones that really kind of hit me hard.
Yeah, it's like it's because it can be prevented. I guess that's the frustration of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I was moved as a child. The strangest thing that caught me was the passenger pigeon, and I just couldn't believe the history stories I was reading that millions of, well, billions of things could disappear simply through hunting. It's sobering our power. We almost don't notice it. Mark, sadly, I'm going to have to bring this to a bit of a close. I've got a few comments I just might read out to you, and if you have a final closing statement, get it ready. But I'll read them out to you. One is Chris Gleedle points out that everything's interdependent, and to remove any part of a system makes the resultant system weaker, which is clearly your bit. And he thanks you, Mark, for your outstanding work and your beautiful but sobering presentation. And Ian Harris came back. I had forgotten myself that we hired you 25 years ago to photograph a human tribe that was soon to be distinct, the founders of Zien. So I'll worry about Ian's health later today. Anyway, Mark, any closing comments before I have to sadly wrap this up?
Wow, I have nothing massively prepared, but I guess one thing I was thinking about, I was walking here. I know a lot of you probably saw the sort of SpaceX Dragon sort of dock with the ISS. I was completely fascinated by it, but what I kind of saw there was like, okay, so how many mines and production facilities, raw materials did it take to get those two things to come together, and how many how much sunlight, ancient sunlight in the form of fossils are we burning to sort of get the Dragon up there? And I think it's all great and good to want to go to the moon and go to Mars and things, but I think we do want to sort of take care of where we are first and do better by all life on Earth.
Well, thank you so much for all of that, Mark. A tremendous number of thanks here, which is always a sign to me I'm running to the end of time. If I could, I'll just turn to three thanks. First set of thanks is to our sponsors. May I express again our genuine appreciation for allowing us to range widely and freely, and I hope today, which was somewhat towards the edge of our envelope, was nevertheless useful. I noticed people staying online for the entire duration, so that's a good sign. Secondly, I'd like to thank you, the audience, a fantastic engagement today, and a note that, as ever, on the website you can find things coming forward. Next week we have a couple of webinars, a particularly interesting one on public official e-markets, an extension of work we did over a decade ago on local exchanges and how they might be coming back with government support, and particularly an interesting case study from Los Angeles. And again, everything else will be up. We'll be taking a small week-long break in August in the webinar series, but hope to keep you interested, entertained, amused, informed as the year progresses. But finally, Mark, you've put a lot of work in today's presentation, and it shows. And I know you expressed your thanks to Morgan for his help, and I will as well. But in particular, I would like to say it was a fantastic one. And unfortunately, in this day and age of COVID and webinars, I'm unable to open up and let the audience applaud you. But I have my kind of circle of life.
There we go.
Karmic, yeah, this is my Korean clapper. So my karmic clapper, as I call it. I will thank you on behalf of the audience. Mark, it's been a real delight.
Yeah.
And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Thank you, Michael.